We are now going to look at the different clause types. So let's see how much you can remember about the different clauses. So we can have a subordinate clause, we can have an embedded clause, and we can have a relative clause. Now, every sentence always has a main clause. A subordinate clause is adding extra information with a subordinate conjunction. Okay, so the subordinate clause doesn't make any sense on its own. Okay, the main clause makes sense on its own, and we'll have a look at some examples in a minute. An embedded clause is a clause that comes in the middle of a sentence. Again, it gives us more information, and it's usually punctuated with 2 commas. So we'll have a look at an embedded clause as well. And then we have relative clauses. Relative clauses can also be subordinate and embedded, just to confuse things. But the thing that's special about relative clauses is they start with a relative pronoun. So who, which, that, etc. So they start with a relative pronoun. Let's have a look at some examples. Here we have a few different examples of sentences with lots of different clause types. I will read them and see if you can guess which one is which. The red dragon lives in warm habitats such as volcanoes or tropical islands. The Fantastic Beasts textbook lists 10 species of dragon who all live in different locations around the world. They prefer to eat meat, especially people. Their scales resemble fur or even feathers in places. One type of dragon is the fire-breathing chimera, which had the upper body of a nymph and the lower body of a sea dragon. Although similar in appearance, Eastern dragons were often more benevolent than their Western counterparts. Okay, so let's have a look. So the first one, the red dragon lives in warm habitats, such as volcanoes or tropical islands. That is a subordinate clause, okay? The main clause is the red dragon lives in warm habitats. I'm going to put an M to show that's the main clause, and this is the subordinate clause. So the red dragon lives in warm habitats. If I just said that on its own, it makes sense on its own. Such as volcanoes or tropical islands. If I took that out, it would still make sense on its own. Okay, the red dragon lives in warm habitats. Fine. If I just said such as volcanoes or tropical islands, if I got rid of the first bit, it doesn't make sense on its own. So that's the subordinate clause. Okay, and the subordinate conjunction is such as. Okay, so that's a subordinate clause. Number 2, the Fantastic Beasts textbook lists 10 species of dragon who all live in different locations around the world. So this bit that I have underlined that you can see is a relative clause because it starts with the relative pronoun who, but it's also a subordinate clause. Okay, it doesn't make sense on its own. The main clause is the Fantastic Beasts textbook lists 10 species of dragon. Fine. You say that on its own, it makes sense on its own. Who all live in different locations around the world. Subordinate clause, relative clause. Number 3, they prefer to eat meat. That is my main clause, especially people. That's my subordinate clause because it has a little bit more information. But if I just said this on its own, especially people, it does not make sense. Okay, I need to have my main clause. Okay, and the main clause should always have a verb in it anyway, to eat. Next, their scales resemble fur or even feathers in places. Here we have the embedded clause because I always say it looks like it's tucked up in the middle, tucked up in bed. It's embedded in the middle of the sentence, okay? If I took this out, the embedded clause, it would still make sense on its own, okay? Their scales resemble fur in places. So the embedded clause gives us extra information and is punctuated with the 2 commas that you can see either side. One type of dragon is the fire-breathing chimera, which has the upper body of a nymph and the lower body of a sea dragon. So here we have got a relative clause because it starts with a relative pronoun which, but it could also be called a subordinate clause. It's mainly a relative clause, but it can also be a type of subordinate clause too. So the main clause is one type of dragon is the fire-breathing chimera. Fine. Which has the upper body of a nymph and the lower body of a sea dragon. That's the extra information, and it's also the subordinate clause. Finally, although similar in appearance, Eastern dragons were often more benevolent than their Western counterparts. Okay, now benevolent means you're kind of kind or placid or gentle. Okay, this, although similar in appearance, that you can see underlined on your screen, is a subordinate clause. But subordinate clauses can come at the beginning of a sentence, as long as you punctuate them with a comma. Okay? Although similar in appearance, Eastern dragons were often more benevolent than their Western counterparts. Do you remember the main clause makes sense on its own and the subordinate clause gives us the additional information? So if I got rid of that, this next bit would still make sense on its own. Eastern dragons were often more benevolent than their Western counterparts. If I just say, so now it's time for your task. Today you are going to experiment with your sentences and using different clause types. Okay, so try and use the different clause types that I just spoke about: embedded, relative, and subordinate clauses for adding extra information. So yesterday we were looking at words and phrases, and today we're moving on to sentences. So put all of these lovely descriptive clauses and sentences towards your dragon description that we're going to work on tomorrow. So again, you are not writing the full description, you are not writing paragraphs, you are just writing your sentences. So jot your ideas down. It doesn't matter if you don't use them in the end. And then on the next page, which you also have in your lesson presentation, there's more prompts to help you. So it says describe all the body parts of the dragon. So think about from head to toe or head to talons, because dragons have talons. Lots of description, different clause types. There's another website here that you can click on and it will bring you to a website that describes dragons. And then finally there's a word mat here with lots of descriptive language on to help you. So about the covering, so on the outside, about its scales or feathers or leathery skin. Okay, we've got the wings and the tail, we've got its character, so is it kind, malicious, ferocious, savage? It might be kind, menacing. Its head, face and eyes, and its legs and its feet.